Why do we still have the issues that we have?
Man, if you're going to break the law, you need to learn it.
Drop the mic.
You're welcome, Mayor Williams.
Okay.
Let's do it.
I can't wait to see the show.
Hey guys, welcome back to According to Michelle with your host, Michelle Taylor Willis. And I know we talk a lot about business and purpose and passion. And I get asked a lot, how do I know I'm living in my passion? How do I know I'm living in my purpose? And I think that question is interesting and it changes per person. But I can tell you this, if it's something that you've thought about doing for a long time since you were a kid and you haven't kind of tapped into it, if it's something that you would likely do for free, and by free I mean if no one ever paid you a dime to do it, you would do it. If it's something that is always kind of like matriculating in the back of your head and you're like, man, I wish I could just do this, or I wish I'd just done this, then likely it could be God or the universe or whatever you call it talking to you. And that just might be your purpose or your passion. And I can tell you this, when you operate in your passion and you know that you're doing exactly what you were put on the earth to do, waters tend to part. Things seem to fall in your lap. It all seems to work out. It doesn't mean it always works out perfectly. It doesn't mean it's always just as you need it to be. But it does seem to work in your favor. And that is when you know you're operating in your passion or your purpose. And the beautiful part is, if you can find a way to monetize that and make that your business, if you make your purpose or your passion your business, then I am telling you, the world will be your oyster. So, speaking of people who have learned how to monetize their passions and live in their purpose, I'm really excited to introduce to you our guest tonight. He is quite a name here in the Atlanta area, but not just in Atlanta. He's made a name for himself across the national landscape because of the work that he's done here in Atlanta and across the nation. It's Milton Little. He's the president and CEO of the United Way of Greater Atlanta, and he has all kinds of wonderful things to tell us about himself and the work that the United Way is doing. So welcome, Milton.
Thank you, Michelle. Always good to see you.
Well, you're welcome. Thanks for joining the According to Michelle show. It took a little while to get you here. You're so busy, but I mean, we finally got you in that chair. So now I'm going to harass you.
That's all right. Everybody's busy. You're busy, so.
I have been a little busier than I have been in the past, but it's all good busy, right? I think since COVID has kind of, it's not gone away, obviously, but we're starting to learn and how to move a little bit in it.
Right.
And so it's making it a little bit easier to try to get back to business. But speaking about business, I mean, your job is basically saving lives, the lives of our children, the lives of our seniors, right? And I mean, have you always been doing that, or is it just something you've fallen into the last, I don't know, 15, 20 years?
For most of my career,
Yeah.
I was doing this. I tell the story that I was a young kid, probably 7, 8 years old. And my mother got her on her knees and she looked at me dead in the eye and she said, whatever you decide to do in life, make sure you're helping somebody.
Wow.
And that always was in the back of my mind. Whatever career decision I made, that was a filter. Am I going to be helping people? And so I've worked in government, I've worked in the private sector, but most of my career has been in the nonprofit human service space.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because when people think nonprofit, they don't always know exactly what that means, because nonprofit businesses are still businesses, right? They have to make money in order to do the work of the people, right? Explain that to our audience a little bit.
Well, there's a misconception. One misconception is that you have to take a vow of poverty to do nonprofit.
Right.
Another misconception is people who do this work couldn't make it in the private sector. And so I try to dispel those misconceptions all the time. These are businesses. They are small mom and pop nonprofits, but they're nonprofits as big as the NFL. Most people don't know that the National Football League, a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, is a nonprofit organization. It's got the same issues that a for-profit business has. You got to hire people, you got to train people, you got to raise resources, you have to deploy them effectively, you have to be on mission, you've got to create business plans. The only difference between a nonprofit and a for-profit business is the definition in the tax code. And that's
Right.
it. Everything else is all about how do you run a business and how do you do it effectively and successfully.
Right. And either way, you got to make money. You can't do the work, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. We're not in the business of earning a profit. But that's the difference. We've got to raise money, and we've got to find it in the same way that for-profit entrepreneurs have to go out and make a case to business leaders and donors and others who may want to take a chance on what they do. It's the same thing in the nonprofit space.
Right. So let me ask you, I want to go back to your mom real quick, because she said, whatever you do, make sure you help people.
Yeah.
Did you see that in your mom? Was she a helper? Was she a community, leader and convener, so to speak?
So my mom was a Cub Scout leader.
Oh, wow.
She was our den mother. She volunteered for the NAACP. She volunteered for the Congress on Racial Equality. When I was 9 years old, I was in the living room making signs for everybody in the neighborhood who was going down to Washington for the March on Washington.
Wow.
So we were involved in those kinds of things as a family. She was a teacher and active in her church, volunteered there, volunteered all across the community. So I learned a lot by watching her give back, and that just became part of what I knew my obligation was as a teenager and as a grown-up.
Well, it's one thing to tell somebody what to do. It's another thing to show them what to do. And I think, excuse me, I say this quite a bit, that as parents, we're the CEOs of our kids, right? We're like they're little businesses, and we're the CEOs. And great leaders develop great leaders. And one of the ways leaders develop is by showing people, right? And actually not just dictating and telling and managing, so to speak. So you are absolutely a product of your environment, but it sounds like your mother was very intentional about how she showed you who she knew that you would end up being, or who you were destined to be.
Yes, but she also was not dictatorial. So she didn't say, this is what you're going to do.
Right.
This is how you do it.
Yeah.
She just showed by example.
Right.
And she invited me and my little sister to be part of that experience. And so it just became one of those things you just came to understand was what you do.
Right.
Regardless of what your profession was, you've got to find a way to give back to the community.
Right.
And we spent a lot of time, I spent a lot of time as a child learning what was then Negro history. I couldn't go out to play until I learned some chapter in a book that my mother had about black folks and their contributions. So I learned about service through those examples too, and the contributions that people made, regardless of their profession, to the betterment of black people in America. So all of that was sort of in the mix in the house that sort of got me where I am right now on your show, talking to you about.
So let me ask you this. The United Way, do you remember, because I would imagine that your first exposure to the United Way was not just when you were going to be interviewing for a position, right? What was your first interaction with the United Way, and how did you know that this was an organization that you wanted to be a part of?
So those are two different things.
Okay.
So my first exposure to the United Way was when I was a child. My father worked for the phone company, and the phone company was on some protracted strike. No income coming in. And one day he brought in bags of groceries. And he said that those came from the United Way.
Wow.
And so I learned about United Way as a recipient. That was long before TV commercials featuring NFL stars and everything else. My first involvement with the United Way was as an employee. And someone came and said, we're going to run a United Way campaign, and here's the pitch. And they talked about this organization you could give to that made contributions to important organizations in the community. And I said, that just makes sense. Where do I sign? And then finally, I was a volunteer in New York City with the United Way, and we were creating foster care homes for black and brown boys who were generally excluded from placements by foster care agencies. And so I was on this advisory board doing that. And that was my first experience as a volunteer. And so, throughout my life, I had entry points into United Way without ever thinking that was a place I'd wind up in as a profession.
Wow, wow. So before we go to break, can you just really quickly tell us, because I know a lot of people, they hear United Way, you know, but what exactly is the United Way?
United Way, think of it as a big table. And you have people from all across the community coming together to discuss what are the big human service issues in this community. Is it homelessness? Is it early education? Is it unemployed people? And they make decisions at that table about what those priorities are. And then they create a strategy for how do you raise money from your neighbors. You go to where they work, or you go to community events, and you make the case for these being the big community issues, and you can help generate the funds to help address them. So that's metaphorically what the United Way is. But really, it's just a charitable organization that's in the business of aggregating the community's goodwill and philanthropy and directing it to the most important community issues.
Which and I'm glad you said that, because again, you know, I don't think people understand that, you know, United Way sends the funds out to the individual organizations, right? Yeah. And so, and people hear all the time, you know, the United Way did this, United Way did that, but they don't understand that the United Way works through the community, through these organizations, through these nonprofit channels, so to speak.
And most often people confuse what we do with how we raise money. They think about us as the workplace charity.
Right.
That you come and you give money to, but that's, like I say, don't confuse how we raise money with what our purpose is.
That's right. Awesome. Well, we just heard you say New York, and so we know that we have sitting in our midst a native New Yorker, which means he's got to love pizza. So we're going to take a quick break. On the other side of this break, we're going to find out what Milton's favorite pizza spot is in New York City. Hang tight, guys. We'll be right back with more According to Michelle. Hey guys, welcome back to According to Michelle, and I'm here with Milton Little, President and CEO of the United Way of Greater Atlanta. And when we left, Milton was about to tell us what his favorite pizza spot is in New York. So I know you haven't been to New York in a long time, but certainly there had to be a place that you loved to go for pizza when you were there.
Sure. So I go back all the time, but I haven't lived
there.
Well,
lived there, sure. Yes.
You know, 15 years.
Sure.
Place called Patsy's.
Patsy's.
It was under the Brooklyn Bridge.
Oh, wow.
The original Patsy's was in East Harlem, and it was one of Frank Sinatra's favorite places. In fact, he would have pizza flown to him in Vegas from the Patsy's in East Harlem.
Is that right?
Exactly.
And that was your favorite spot?
Yeah. So if you go to Antico here in town.
Yeah, which has great pizza.
So it is modeled after Patsy's in Brooklyn.
Okay, so I hate to do this to you, but I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
Antico's, Patsy's. Is it close?
Oh, yeah.
Because Antico's is like, that pizza I think is probably, it's amazing.
It is. You know, one of the nation's best, but Patsy's was the predecessor.
No, is Patsy still there?
You know, I don't think so. The owner sold it, it became a chain.
Got you, and things change when that happens.
You know, a couple of levels in quality and stuff. Yeah.
Something that will never happen at the United Way for sure. Drop down levels.
As long as
quality.
I'm there.
Well, and you're gonna be there forever. You can't go anywhere.
I can't. Oh yeah. Okay.
So no, you can't. So let's talk a little bit about that, right? Dive a little bit into the work that the United Way is actually doing, and certainly here in Atlanta. So child well-being. I know that the children are one of the fundamental, the fundamentals really for what the United Way stands for, and as you know, and I've been reading a lot about this lately, especially now through the pandemic. Just about the disparity in Atlanta. I pulled several different reports. Between 2017 and 2019, it kind of vacillates between the number one and number two city for disparity.
Yep.
Right? We've got the richest blacks and the poorest blacks at the same time.
Correct.
Right? What does that mean for our children?
That means hard times if you're born poor. If you're born poor in Greater Atlanta, you have less than a 5% chance of ever escaping poverty through a combination of work and education by age 30 than almost any other city in the United States. We go back and forth with Charlotte for being the worst. And so you basically are telling a poor child in Greater Atlanta, if you're born poor, the odds are pretty good you're going to die poor. Wow. And I don't think that's a promise that any of us ought to make to any child.
Absolutely. So what is the United Way doing to counter that?
So we created something called the Child Wellbeing Movement. And basically it is a way to draw attention to this disparity and to raise money from institutional donors like foundations and corporations or ordinary folks like you.
Ordinary? There's nothing about me ordinary, Milton. I need to take that back.
People who don't feel themselves to be a Bill Gates, a philanthropist, somebody who may be able to give $2 a paycheck.
That's me.
Yeah, so those, folks all across that spectrum
right.
who may be moved by this idea that we ought to have a better promise for our children. And so we will raise that money and then we'll invest it in a variety of initiatives. How do you make sure kids are born healthy? Make sure their moms have prenatal care. Make sure kids have a doctor when they're born. How do you make sure kids get to school with the skills they need to be successful? So you got to make sure they have early learning experiences. Make sure moms know that they don't have to be PhDs to raise their kids effectively and teach them how to read. All they have to do is start talking to them at the very earliest ages. There is never an age that's too young to talk to a child.
Right.
How do you help make sure people who want to work find a job? Those who are stuck in dead-end jobs find career advancing opportunities. And so it's all about how do you solve the problems that people have. And by doing that, you make sure you create an environment in which children have an opportunity to prosper.
Got you. Well, I know that's a huge focus for you guys. And we're actually going to take a little break here and show you a little bit about what Milton does, what his days look like, and what the United Way actually looks like on the ground, boots on the ground. So let's check that out.
Okay.
And we'll be right back. Welcome back, guys. We're here with Milton Little, and you got to see a little bit of the kind of work that he does and the United Way does on a day-to-day basis. So again, I know that the United Way has this focus on children for sure, but kids need places to live, right? I mean, we are, again, bouncing back and forth between, are we going to have an eviction crisis and a housing crisis? I mean, what is United Way doing to help in that regard?
We have been a proud partner with the City of Atlanta, funded by CARES Act dollars that had been deployed by the federal government last year to help people who live in the City of Atlanta who are at risk of eviction stay in their home. And so this is whether you're renting or you happen to be a homeowner, but you're falling behind on your mortgage payments. And so these dollars, about $22 million, have been deployed in the City of Atlanta. That program runs out at the end of March. We will have spent all of the money and probably served close to 7,000 households through that work. Yeah.
So when the United Way does these specific raises, so to speak, are there literal funds set up just for these individual? So for the eviction relief fund. I know you guys had a COVID-19 fund that had millions of dollars that was distributed to that. $30 million.
That was a partnership with the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta, where we, at the launch of the pandemic, went into fundraising mode and deployed that money across a variety of issue areas: food assistance, housing assistance, technology for kids that were now doing distance learning but didn't have the hardware or access to the internet that they needed in order to stay current with school. There were a whole host of issues related to the pandemic that we raised money and deployed it to help address.
Right, and people don't know that. That's why I'm so glad you're here, so that people understand that United Way isn't just this, entity they see advertising and asking for money. I mean, the money that is raised is literally getting distributed to the organizations that can get it into the community, into the hands of the people that need it.
Exactly.
And so you mentioned, we talked a little bit about homelessness. In Atlanta, and I've heard people saying, I've been reading a little bit on this, but people feel like the homeless challenge in Atlanta has gotten worse. Is that accurate, or does it just feel different? Because
I think it feels different. For a number of years, Atlanta was the only city in the United States where the annual homeless census was going down, contrary to the experiences in Washington, D.C., or Los Angeles, or San Francisco. Homelessness in Atlanta, I think, it's a story about it's contradictions. Number one, I think it's more visible now. You see homelessness on bridges. You see it in parks. So it's become more visible, even as we have increased the number of transitional houses we've been able to build and permanent supportive housing for people in homelessness. And so people are seeing that and saying it's exploding.
Right.
We also have a challenge. Housing's just getting too expensive in Atlanta.
Yeah, because the thing about affordable housing, 20 years ago, affordable housing meant the projects. Now, affordable housing is a home between $200,000 and $400,000.
Exactly.
I mean, the whole landscape has changed.
It has.
But that's $400,000 is not an affordable house for the people on the wrong side of that disparity number.
No, absolutely not. We're having a conversation nationally now about a $15 an hour minimum wage. And folks don't want to pay that.
Right.
But they also are looking at the fact that if you're making today's minimum wage, you are making poverty wages. Yes. And so we're in this sort of environment in which we've got these contradictions. And we've got to figure out how to make sure anybody who's working 40 hours a week or 35 hours a week, whatever it is, isn't in poverty.
Right.
And we also have to figure out how to have housing that's affordable.
Yeah.
That isn't $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000.
Right.
But a teacher or a policeman or a fireman or somebody who just is out there hustling every day can have a safe and secure place to live and raise a family. That's the only thing that any of us want.
Yeah. Well, listen, I know that you're the guy leading the charge, and if anybody can figure all these problems out, you can.
Well, let me say this. Let me say this.
You have a fantastic team around you.
I do
know that.
I do, but one thing people need to know about the United Way is it depends on volunteers like you. The United Way is not the professional staff at 40 Cortland. It's people like you who decide, I want to make a difference in the community, and here's the organization I want to do it with. We would be nothing without volunteers who raise the money, who decide how it's going to get spent, who monitor and manage and evaluate agencies. United Way is the people in the community who decide they want to make a difference, not Milton Little CEO sitting in an office.
Well, I think some of your Morehouse training might have had something to do with that mindset of yours, right?
Well, they told us we needed to be leaders in community.
Well, between Morehouse and your mom, you got it right?
I couldn't stray from either one of those teachings.
So speaking of which, I know you're an HBCU guy, so at the end of every According to Michelle, we play a game.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, and so it's like, HBCU mascots.
Okay.
We can't afford our own music, so I have to make it up for every game. So,
you
all right.
fine.
So what I'm gonna do is give you a mascot.
Oh, Lord.
And you have to tell me what college.
I'm about to get my black card revoked.
Okay. Maroon Tiger.
Well, Morehouse.
Okay, I gave you an easy one. I tried to lay it up
Stop
for
here.
you.
Cut.
These should be so easy. If you get these wrong, you're getting your Atlanta card revoked.
Okay.
Panthers.
Panthers. Oh, Georgia State, right?
Oh, that's not the parent. That's not an HBCU. It almost is.
I would go to, it
Sure,
depends on who
really
you talk
close.
to.
Really close. Yes. Try another one.
Oh, Clark.
There you go. And this is easy. Jaguars.
The Jaguars. Oh,
Oh, come on. I'm laying this up for you. They're so easy.
I know,
Just stay on the AUC.
I'm trying. Jaguars. Oh, who's that?
Spellman.
Oh, okay.
What? Did you
They don't
just?
have, but I'm thinking, what sports do they have?
Well, I mean, okay, we're going to cut right there. There's tons of
I
sports.
know, Mary Smith Campbell's going to get me.
She is going to be on you. You heard that here first, Mary. Yeah, he did it. Listen, thank you so much for joining the According to Michelle show. Can
Thanks
you
for having
please
me.
let people know how they can volunteer with the United Way, whether they're here in Georgia or anywhere?
Sure. All you have to do is go to our website, unitedwayatlanta.org, and there's a portal that'll get you to volunteering. Or you can call 211, and that will get you to a call operator and just tell them you want to give service, and they'll help you find a place where you can make a difference.
Awesome. Thank you, Milton, for coming in.
Michelle, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And guys, volunteering is a thing, service is a thing, community is a thing, and community absolutely starts with us. And speaking of community, we've got a new community. We're here on the VTV network. We're really excited to be here. You can catch me on the VTV network, and I am at Michelle Taylor Willis on just about everything, except I'm Michelle T. Willis on Clubhouse now, if you're one of those. Absolutely reach out to me, find me, but most importantly, come back next week and see us right here on the According to Michelle show. See ya.
The power of connection. There are multiple roads to success. Each business or entrepreneur charts their own course. Maybe you had a great mentor that specifically guided you.
I just need help.
Or a connection with a banking officer that showed you beneficial programs you didn't know existed. The South Fulton Chamber of Commerce is your connector to everything you and your business need.
Hey guys, welcome to According to Michelle with Michelle Taylor Willis. I am here in beautiful downtown Atlanta at Concept House. So if you ever come to Atlanta and you need a place to create a concept or something, you got to make sure you come here and check out my friends. But before we get started today, I want to talk to you just a little bit about significance. And it's 2021 and a lot of people are talking about the successes that they didn't have in 2020. And they're focused on what that success might look like for 2021. So here's my challenge for you. Forget about success. Success is not a thing. Success is only a thing if you're looking to be successful and not significant. Significance is when you empower people to empower people, right? Success is when you've made it and your circle, right? Your family, your friends, you're all good. You got the husband or the wife and the 2.5 kids and the dog, great job, and everything is just sailing along for you. But significance is that next level of success, right? Yeah, think about that for a second. Significance is when you play in circles that aren't just about you or your circle, but are about circles for people that you've never met, that you've never seen. That's legacy. And it really begs the question, what do you want people to say about you when you're gone? That's your legacy, and that's significance. And in 2021 and whatever comes after this, that's what we should be playing for. People are counting on us to make big decisions so that our kids and their kids and their kids can be better. So I say forget about success and think about significance and what are you really playing for. So speaking of that, I've got somebody who is absolutely playing in the realm of significance with us tonight. He is turning like this whole clinical trial study upside down, but I'm not going to spoil it for you. I'm going to let him tell us a little bit about it. But I do want to introduce you guys to Dr. Nathan Bryan, who is the founder and CEO of Nitric Oxide Innovations. And he's doing some amazing things clinically in the medical space. I'm really excited to learn more about him. and to see how he is leaving his legacy. So welcome, Dr. Bryan.
Thank you, Michelle.
How are
Great.
you?
I'm great.
So thanks for coming here all the way from the biggest state in the union. Well, I guess not union, but in the land, I guess I should say.
That's right. Well, it's a great honor and pleasure to be with you tonight.
I'm glad you're here. So my first question is this: is everything really bigger in Texas?
Well, there's a reason that saying has stood the test of time. So yes, it is.
Even the cinnamon rolls. I saw this thing one time where this guy was from Texas and he was making cinnamon rolls, and the cinnamon rolls were literally like as big as my upper body. I mean, they were huge, and I was like, if everything in Texas is that big, I don't think I want to go there.
Well, you've got a reputation to live up to, so we try to go big or go home.
Well, you're going big or going home.
are.
So you were born and raised in Texas, right?
I grew up in a small town in Texas, went to the University of Texas in Austin, got a degree in biochemistry, went on to LSU Medical School in Houston, and then did some training up in Boston, and then tried to find my quickest route back south to Texas, and I landed back there in my first faculty position in 2006.
So did you always, did you know that you were going to be a doctor? Did you have like, one of those medical sets or something?
No, I didn't. In high school, in a small high school, we have counselors. I was always good in math and science. Mm-hmm. And when you're good in math and science, they tell you to go into engineering or science.
Sure.
So I did that. I followed that path. And then when I was at the University of Texas, I did undergraduate research. I was pursuing a degree in biochemistry. I was always interested and intrigued in how to solve complex problems. And I think one of the biggest problems, even 30 years ago and still today, is some really major medical problems that plague Americans. And so those are major problems that I set out to solve. And so that really was my journey and mission from very early on.
Well, I think clearly you were destined for greatness, right? Even through your, history and career as a physician. I mean, you've gotten all kinds of awards and received tons of accolades for the work that you've done in the research. Where did that come from? Did you always feel like you were going to be on this path to doing great things, or did you just feel like, I'll go on, I'll be a doctor, I'll see some patients and, help people with diabetes and be on my way?
Well, I became interested in the basic sciences, and I'm a basic scientist. But the longer I live and I look back and reflect upon and really realize how little effect I had on my life. I think I was guided, and God puts people in your life at different times
Sure.
and directs you to certain things. And so, just as many successes as I've had just as many, if not more, failures. And I think the most important thing is that we learn from those failures, and it makes you pivot. Mm-hmm. And it's those pivots at times, at really critical times in life, that really set you up for a lot of the success. So, I knew that I always had this notion that, I wanted to leave a legacy, and you opened this with significance. And I think that's very important. And I think, everybody, my mission has always been to make contributions that leave a lasting legacy. And that's really the true meaning of significance. And I think what we're doing now in terms of developing novel, safe, and effective therapies in the African American community is a legacy-leaving effort. And I'm very excited about that, and grateful to share that story with you today.
Yeah. So it's interesting you mentioned pivoting, and you also mentioned failures. And some of the most significant people in history, right, have had tons of failures and maybe not that many successes, so to speak.
That's right.
But the successes were so big and so grand that they were significant, and so it almost, kind of extinguished these misses or the failures, and the pivots as well. So talk to me about a pivot that you had to make, right, to out of maybe a failure or a miss.
Well, in this little microcosm that I live in, which is in nitric oxide biology, which is a very specific realm of science and medicine, there's 170,000 published papers on nitric oxide.
No, I did not know that.
Most people don't. Most people don't know what nitric oxide is. But during the course of my 20 years of research, we had a number of failures. And so in a scientific experiment, you design an experiment expecting a certain outcome. When you don't get that outcome, it's a failure. Or in your mind, it's a failure.
Sure.
But every single outcome is a learning experience. And so you have to then figure out, okay, what did we learn from this? You didn't get the answer that you wanted. That's very important in life. Nobody gets the answer they want. But what do you learn from that so-called negative experience or negative answer? And then you redesign your experiment, you redesign your life and figure out, take that learning and then pivot and then redirect your efforts to make a more informed decision. And that's what we've done over the past really 30 years in terms of developing safe and effective nitric oxide therapeutics. Learn from the mistakes, learn from what people have learned from their negative experiences, and then redirect that and figure out, okay, what are those learnings, what are those teachings that we can now figure out the mechanism of disease to the extent that you can then rationalize viable therapy based on the mechanism of disease in humans. That's been my focus and my mission for the past 20 years.
So let's talk about this nitric oxide thing, because when people think about medicine, clearly nitric oxide isn't the first thing that comes to their mind, right? So did you like sniff this in college or something? You're like, I think I'm onto something here.
No, it's nitric oxide, not nitrous oxide, or not the other,
Not the laughing gas?
not the laughing gas, and not the isoamyl nitrite that's used as a recreational drug.
Wait,
but it is a gas.
Wait, I don't use anything as a recreational drug, so, there's
Well,
that.
some people do. But yeah, I think there's a misnomer. So it's nitric oxide, what we're talking about. Nitrous oxide is a general anesthetic that's called the laughing gas. But I was introduced this back in probably the early 2000s, and a Nobel Prize had been awarded in 1998 for the discovery of nitric oxide. So we as a scientific community knew it was very important. Obviously, a Nobel Prize has been awarded. It has major significance on human disease. But there was so very little known about it. And so when I got involved in really trying to understand the basic science of nitric oxide, number one, how does the human body produce it? What goes wrong in people that can't produce it? What are the clinical consequences? And then how do you fix the underlying problem? So those have been the four fundamental questions that have really directed my research program and everything I've done for the past 20 years. And so fast forward, I guess 21 years, we now know how the human body makes nitric oxide. We know what goes wrong in people that can't make it. We know what the clinical consequences are, and now we know how to fix it. And I think that's the reason we're here today, is to educate the community on the importance of this critical molecule, because it truly is a story of what you don't know can kill you.
Wow. So if I understand you correctly, nitric oxide is produced by the body.
That's right. It's naturally produced in the lining of the blood vessel. It's what regulates blood flow and perfusion to every tissue in the body. So for instance, when you begin to exercise, you increase the work capacity of the heart. So you've got to increase blood flow to the heart. And so in order to do that, you've got to generate nitric oxide, which then dilates the blood vessels to increase the oxygen and nutrient demand of the heart. And if your body can't make nitric oxide, you can't increase blood flow to the heart, and you fail on exercise stress test. That's just one example. If you're trying to remember where you left your keys, you've got to increase blood flow to certain regions of the brain to recall that memory.
Right.
But if you can't, because you can't make nitric oxide, then you develop vascular dementia, mild cognitive disorders, and eventually you get Alzheimer's.
So obviously, now that you're saying there's a direct correlation between the lack of nitric oxide in your body and diseases like dementia.
Every single age-related chronic disease associated with loss of nitric oxide. Wow. From Alzheimer's to diabetes to high blood pressure to heart disease to even sexual dysfunction. I mean,
well, now there you go. You're welcome.
So if you want to increase blood flow to the pelvic region to get an erection in both men and women, you have to increase your production of nitric oxide to dilate the blood vessels to get engorgement and increase blood flow. If your body does not and cannot produce nitric oxide, you develop erectile dysfunction in both men and women. So it's every single chronic disease comes down to a lack of circulation or lack of blood flow.
Wow. So here's what I find this interesting about this is nobody's talking about nitric oxide.
That's
and
right.
I've been in the medical community. I mean, I was in the first half of my life was in medical sales, medical consulting. I don't remember anyone talking about, certainly not at length,
Sure.
about nitric oxide and its contribution to these diseases. Why isn't the medical community talking about this?
Well, I think there's a natural lag of, it takes an average of 17 years for new scientific discoveries to reach the standard of care. That's kind of known throughout history. But I think the other kind of hurdles we have to overcome is that when you go to your doctor and you get labs, there's not a lab for lack of nitric oxide like there is
Right.
for a lack of vitamin D, or your cholesterol's too high, your triglycerides. There's not a lab for nitric oxide. And I think that really creates a lot of hurdles for the implementation of nitric oxide-based therapies into primary care and primary practice. So, you know, it's been my mission to change that. And over the past really 10 or 15 years, I've tried to go out and educate the medical community. I give probably 50 or 60 lectures a year all over the world,
Wow.
trying to explain the importance of nitric oxide in not just primary care, but in the management of chronic disease, such as cardiovascular disease, the #1 killer of men and women worldwide. And now it's unequivocally due to the lack of nitric oxide production. And so to me, that people die of cardiovascular disease every day, every second, is unacceptable, because we know what the cause is, we know how to diagnose it, and now we have the technology to overcome that. So to me, it's completely unacceptable, and the only limiting factor now is education and awareness. And so that's where I think this is so important, is that we have to educate the community on the importance of nitric oxide, because as I said, lack of understanding will lead to increased illness and death.
Absolutely. Well, knowledge really is, it's so funny, I say a lot, and I hear a lot of people saying this too, right? Knowledge isn't power, it's the application of that knowledge.
That's right.
But we got to start with the knowledge. And so there are so many people out there that have no idea that this is even a thing, right? So it's interesting because I know that now a lot of your work is focused on the Black community, right?
That's right.
And we got to take a quick break. But when we come back from that break, I want to dive a little bit deeper into exactly what you're doing with nitric oxide and specifically the Black community. So we're going to take a quick break, but I got a question for you. You guys know I love games, and we know that Dr. Bryan is from Texas, and he loves Texas so much that he went to Boston and was like, get me the hell out of here. I got to get back to Texas. So he has a favorite city somewhere in the United States, and it ain't Boston, and it's not Austin either. So when we come back from break, he's going to tell us exactly what that is. But in a minute, or while we're on break, I want you guys thinking about it, okay? So hang tight. We'll be right back with more According to Michelle. Welcome back, guys, to According to Michelle with Michelle Taylor Willis. And when we left, I asked you guys what you thought Dr. Bryan's favorite city in the United States was. And so he's about to tell us, but not before I give you the great music. Name his favorite state. See, I'll put the T on it. That's how you know I'm serious about it. Okay. I mean, not state. Oh, wait, I got to do it again. Name his favorite city. See, I did when I put the T. That's how you know I mean it. Okay. So what is your favorite city?
Well, Michelle, it has to be, I mean, look, there's no place like home.
Oh, gosh. Is it someplace in Texas?
Home to me is a place called Lexington, Texas. I live
Not to be confused with Lexington, Kentucky.
Not Lexington, Kentucky, or not Lexington, Massachusetts, but Lexington, Texas. It's a town of about 1,000 people. I live on a several hundred-acre ranch just outside of Lexington. My kids go to Lexington. It's home of Snow's Barbecue, the #1 barbecue in the U.S. And so, you know, when I travel over 100,000 air miles a year. Spend about 150 nights in a hotel. So to me, going home is my refuge. It's where I kind of decompress and think about things, and then get refocused, and then get out and do my job.
Do it all over again.
Do it all over again. And so to me, that's home. It's therapy. I can go out on my ranch and feed the cows, and get on my tractor, bulldozer, and knock shit down and tear shit up and relieve some anger, and it's therapy.
I love it. So let me ask you about this then. Talk about legacy and therapy and Black people and COVID.
Yeah.
Right? So you're in phase 3 trials, right?
That's right.
For a study with a COVID treatment. And your study participants are all Black.
That's right.
That is complete. Has that ever happened before?
It's never happened.
I was going to say, I've looked, and I can't, just without looking, I would know that that's never happened before, right? But then I was like, well, maybe, I don't know. So I go researching this. I can't find a study that it's ever been just Blacks. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, with good reason. I mean, we've known historically, and this has been known for decades.
Sure.
African Americans suffer from higher incidence of high blood pressure, diabetes, kidney disease, certain types of cancer. And so those health disparities have been known for many, many years, but yet no one's done anything about it. COVID has reminded us that the African Americans are more susceptible to COVID infection. So about a 3-time higher rate of infection, about a 5-time higher rate of hospitalization, and a 4, depending on which reports you read, a 4 to 10-time higher rate of death from COVID. So why is that? If we look back over the past 20 years, we know it's due to a lack of nitric oxide. And so that's why
So black people produce less nitric oxide than...
African Americans produce less nitric oxide than any other ethnic or racial group out there. And there's both genetic and environmental factors, lifestyle factors that contribute to that. But unequivocally, mechanistically, we know that African Americans produce less nitric oxide. It explains their higher incidence of everything I mentioned, from high blood pressure, heart disease, kidney disease, pulmonary disease, cancer. And now it explains the increased risk of infection, increased risk of rate of hospitalization, and increased risk of death from COVID. So it makes perfect sense scientifically to develop a nitric oxide therapy to give to African Americans upon early onset of diagnosis of COVID, and when they get mild to even asymptomatic patients. So if we start the therapy early on, the preliminary data tell us that we can basically prevent hospitalization, admission in the ICU, and death from COVID. And to me, that's significance, and that's legacy.
Wow, so this is interesting because this isn't just you. You have a few other black doctors that are in this fight with you.
That's right.
So how did you decide that this is what, this was going to be your lot right now, right? I mean, obviously COVID is a thing right now, but did they come to you? Did you go to them? How did you land here?
I sought them. I mean, because what we know is that most people survive COVID. I mean, we've got a 99.97% survival rate in most populations. However, in the African American community, it's much different. So we wanted to target the very vulnerable, the very susceptible population that we can introduce a therapy early on and prevent this rapid progression of disease. Historically, African Americans are underrepresented in all clinical trials.
Absolutely.
So
even in especially in the vaccine studies.
Yeah,
right?
Only about 5% of the African American community has been vaccinated, whether that's the flu or whether it's COVID, where 50 to 60% of Caucasians get vaccinated. And look, there's good reason for the mistrust and for that. It goes back to the Tuskegee trials.
Right, I'm glad you mentioned that because I wanted to ask you about that, but yeah.
And so what we've learned is that there's distrust, and even in the vaccines have never been tested in the African American community. They're tested in white German men. So we don't know, and so what that means historically in all drug trials is we don't know how African Americans are going to respond to this particular therapy, whether it's safe, whether it's effective, and we know that they're so-called non-responders to traditional therapy in the African American community. For heart failure, for example, African Americans typically don't respond to the standard therapy for heart failure, and so there's reasons for that mechanistically, and it all goes back to the lack of nitric oxide production. So when we designed this trial, we went to the FDA and filed our investigative new drug application to only enroll African Americans, because if we can change the progression of disease and hospitalization and death in the African American community, all other communities will respond very favorably. Most importantly, we have to gain the trust of the African American community. And so the only way we do that is provide the education, provide the information, provide the sound scientific rationale for involving African Americans in this particular study, because COVID just reminded us of the health disparities.
Right.
We've known this for many, many decades.
Absolutely.
And so we aim to change that.
Okay, we got to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to talk to you about just the drug treatments that are used, because there are a lot of side effects, even just from diabetes meds or heart disease meds, and I'm wondering if there's a connection there, because the side effects are so prevalent in blacks, but if they're not tested on blacks, then you know what I mean?
That's right. That's a very good point.
Right, so I want to talk a little bit about that. Guys, hang tight. We'll be right back with more According to Michelle. Hey guys, welcome back to According to Michelle, and I'm here with Dr. Bryan, who is the founder and CEO of Nitric Oxide Innovations. And he's also spearheading a study right now on a COVID treatment, and it's being really tested only in African Americans here in the United States. So we went to break. I was asking you a little bit about the side effects for so many common treatments of ailments or diseases that are very prevalent in the Black community. And I'm just wondering if those side effects are so high because none of these drugs have been tested on.
That's right. Well, it certainly explains a lot of the unknowns, because if African Americans don't participate in clinical trials, we don't know how different people respond to different medications. But here's the interesting thing, and I think really the most promising thing about our therapeutic is most drugs are inhibitors of certain reactions, biochemical reactions. So when you inhibit a certain biochemical reaction in the human body, the body always responds. And so you have unanticipated side effects or consequences of that. The difference in our therapy is we're basically repleting and restoring what's naturally produced in the body. So the best example is vitamin D. If you're deficient in vitamin D, what's the best thing you can do? Well, you take vitamin D. If you're deficient in nitric oxide, what's the best thing you do? Take a nitric oxide. So that's what we do. We develop a nitric oxide delivery system that's an orally disintegrating tablet that when you put it in your mouth, it dissolves over 5 to 6 minutes, and we liberate this gas that restores your body's production and availability of nitric oxide. So we're not inhibiting any reactions, so we don't expect any side effects. We're basically giving the body what it needs, and when you give the body what it needs, the body heals itself.
Right.
That's the basis for safe and effective therapeutics.
So what are, oh, I'm sorry.
No, but I think that the most important thing about this is how this reacts, because we know mechanistically for 20 years, 30 years, that African Americans have a lack of nitric oxide production that explains the entire health disparities across the broad spectrum of every major chronic disease. Wow. So if we give that back, how does this particular population respond? Mechanistically, we know that they're deficient. If we replete it, how do they respond? And that's why this trial is so important. It just so happens that it happens in a time of COVID, which is hospitalizing and killing more African Americans than is necessary. Right. So we think we can, we really truly believe we can save the Black race from these unnecessary deaths.
Wow. So what is the most interesting thing you're finding out as you're going through these trials?
Well, the data shows, so this is what we call a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. It's the gold standard in clinical trial design. We send people, and so if you're diagnosed with COVID, there's a lot of fear involved. But what we're finding is that you're sent home typically until you get really sick, then you're hospitalized. So what we do is we send you home with a pulse oximeter so we can measure your blood oxygen levels. And really that's what leads to the demise of most people. So when you can't deliver oxygen to the tissues of the body, people die. Right. So when your blood oxygen levels reach 80s and 70s, that's called sometimes silent hypoxemia. So you're basically suffocating.
Got it.
Yeah, silent hypoxemia. So, but nobody knows that.
Right.
So what we do is we send you home with a pulse oximeter so we can measure in real time what your blood oxygen levels are. And then we can communicate with these people through telemedicine and say, have you taken your study medication? Most of the time they haven't, so we remind them to take it. And then they take their study medication, and 10 minutes later we can see their blood oxygen levels go to 94.
So you can see immediate impact.
Immediate results within 10 minutes.
Like you don't have to wait.
We don't have to wait. And really, it's supposed to be blinded, but half the people, their blood oxygen levels are coming up, half the people, they're staying the same or getting worse, and those people are hospitalized. So those are the data that, we're supposed to be blinded to, but we can tell from the clinical data that we're gathering which patients are on the active, which patients are on the placebo, and we're seeing patients get better.
Wow. So what are you hoping will be the outcome of this? And then how do you think this is going to affect COVID, especially in Black population, as we move forward?
Well, the media is trying to convince everybody that vaccines are the answer. I can tell you unequivocally that vaccines are not the answer. If vaccines were the answer, then people wouldn't get the flu and die of the flu. We have flu vaccine that's administered every year, but yet hundreds of thousands of people get the flu, tens of thousands of people die from the flu every year. This particular vaccine has never been tested in humans. It's a messenger RNA vaccine, and it's truly untested. The point is that there are variants, there are mutants, viruses evolve that the vaccine won't cover. So even if people get vaccinated, there's still going to be a need for safe and effective therapeutics when people get sick. That's where we come in. The other important component is that if you just look at the statistics, half of Americans don't want a vaccine, and especially in the African American community. I think I've seen numbers 60 to 70% of the African American community don't trust a vaccine.
Sure.
And they're underrepresented in vaccinations now. But yet, I think that's the first community that wants to undergo mass vaccination. So there's a disconnect there from the science to the message that's been put out by the media. So what we hope is that we want to complete this study. We have 840 patients to be enrolled in the study. If the data continue and we continue to make people better, then once we complete the study, we'll file for our drug application to the US FDA and hopefully get drug approval and get this on the market to save the lives of not just the African American community, but people around the world, because
Right, because
everything
we know if it works in blacks, then it's going to work.
That's right. Everything we've learned about COVID over the past year points to a lack of nitric oxide production. People with comorbidities do the worst. People with high blood pressure, heart disease, kidney
Right.
disease, all these are symptoms of lack of nitric oxide. If we give the nitric oxide back, we mitigate the risk factors, and then basically we have a 99.7% survival across all ethnicities, all races, all people. And that's actually better than the flu.
And that, my friends, is significant. Wow, that's amazing. All right, so one thing you don't know, because you've never been on my show, is that we always play a game at the very end. So you might be a great nitric oxide doctor, but how good are you at being a regular old doctor? Let's test his skills, shall we? Doom, doom, doom. We don't have enough money in the budget for music, so I have to make my own.
Okay, that's fine.
All right, so I'm going to give you a couple of symptoms, and you're going to tell me what you think the diagnosis is, okay?
Okay.
All right, so the first one is shortness of breath and dizziness.
Shortness of breath and dizziness.
I realize that could be a lot of things, but let's just see
It
if
could
you
be a
get
lot
it
of
right.
things. Well, if we look back, I'm a basic scientist by training, and so I look at the fundamental mechanisms of disease. So what that tells me is if you have shortness of breath, you have lack of oxygen being delivered to the lungs,
Yeah,
which then means you have lack of oxygen being delivered to the heart, and there's less oxygen being perfused to the brain, and that develops hypoxemia and dizziness. So it's either two things, it's lack of oxygen or low blood pressure.
pulmonary hypertension, does that count?
Well, actually, pulmonary hypertension is basically when the blood vessels of the pulmonary circulation aren't generating enough nitric oxide.
It all comes back to this
It all
damn
comes back to
nitric oxide, doesn't it?
So if you can't open up the blood vessels to allow for oxygen exchange in the lungs, the blood doesn't pick up the oxygen, you can't perfuse the heart, you can't perfuse the brain, you get dizziness.
You win this round, doctor, but only this one. Okay, listen, I'm done with this game. I don't like it. Okay, so anyway, but thank you very much. I love this. Great job. All right, thank you for coming on. This was
you.
fantastic, incredible information. Can you please tell our viewers how they can find you if they want to participate in the study, how they can do so?
We have a landing page called www.aacovidstudy.com. Got all the information on the clinical trial, all the information on really the background information of what the drug does, what it's intended to do, all the health disparities of African Americans, and really why we're doing this study in African Americans. You can actually see if you qualify for the study. So if you or someone you know is African American, age 50 to 85, diagnosed with COVID within the last 72 hours, with at least one underlying comorbidity, whether it's high blood pressure, diabetes, smoking, kidney disease, or heart disease, then you qualify for the study. So visit our website, aacovidstudy.com.
Wow. Again, thank you so much. If there's anything that we can do for you, absolutely let us know. And you heard it here first, guys, right? We always try to do we always do a great job of bringing you the best and the brightest, whether they're right here in Atlanta or in the great state of Texas. Guys, thanks again for joining us on According to